So this is an up-close and personal video. I don't want to continue streaming because I'm done with audience interaction for the day, but I did just want to get this out there, this idea that I just had, because I don't know that I can really write it down and explain what it is that I mean by it. Basically, my theory of history, the history of philosophy, the history of science, the history of technology, the history of religion, the history of progress, going back to the agricultural revolution, the invention of urbanism, the invention of religion, the invention of philosophy and science in ancient Greece. It was with Thales and Pythagoras and Plato and Aristotle and Archimedes. This got transferred to the Romans, and they didn't really make much development in the philosophical front per se. They were making more advances, really in military technology, military strategy, Roman law, which Kurt has correctly called a technology. So they made sort of technical expansions in terms of physical space and taking over the Mediterranean. You know, they had a little bit of a collapse for maybe Spenglerian reasons or otherwise. And then they were sort of taken up, the mantle was taken up by the Germans, the Holy Roman Empire, the Franks with Charlemagne and Pippin and Otto. And they took that up and they took that upon themselves. And they spread out into Russia and in Europe. You had, of course, I'm not going to recapitulate the entire history of England, but England had the Celts, and it had the Romans, and it had the Anglo-Saxons, and then it had the Vikings, and then it had the Normans, and so on and so forth. And so there's this gradual development over time, and Europe stabilizes itself after this period of chaos and gets to the humanism of the Renaissance. Prior to this, you could say there was a scholastic nominalist revolution in European thought. And then you get into things like the Enlightenment. So I'm kind of just saying these things over and over again. I've said them many times before. But what Guénon, well, I haven't read, but apparently Zazi has explained to me that Guénon says that history is about the progress or the struggle between quantity and quality. So that initially things are qualitative. In Jean Gebser's language, this is the magical consciousness structure. Things are qualitative. They are sacred. They cannot be dissected. They cannot be questioned. They are qualitative. They are the thing in itself and not a simulation, not a representation. It's the thing in itself. And then quantity takes hold. And then you get the mythic consciousness structure, and this is Pythagoras, and he's saying, well, you know, yeah, we're still divine, it's still religious, it's still metaphysical, but now we're going to take the traditions of the Hyperboreans and the Semites and the Greeks, and we're going to syncretize them. And we're going to remove them from their sacred spaces. No longer do we worship Marduk, we worship the one, the monad. We're not going to worship Odin, we're not going to worship Zeus. We're going to worship the concept of kingship, the concept of oneness, right? So it's the reduction of these qualities in themselves as personas, as magical archetypes, which cannot be questioned. And it is the syncretism of them. Now, oftentimes people look back at what the Romans did, and they said, well, this is what the Romans did. The Romans would go to the Greeks, and they would say, oh, well, your gods are like our gods. Zeus is like Jupiter. They go into Egypt and they'd say, oh, your gods are like our gods. They go to Germany and they'd say, oh, well, you know, basically Thor is like Hermes or whatever, or Mercury. So they would do this syncretism. And so because when people conceive of paganism, oftentimes they think of Romanism. They believe that ancient paganism was syncretic. And they believe that the original human religion was a syncretic religion, that is, a religion which was tolerant, a religion which went around and said, oh, your religion is like my religion. But that is specific to the Pythagorean tradition of the mythic consciousness structure, which looks at these different analogies and compares them together. But already that is a divorcing from the magical consciousness structure where these people are real people. And their names are not mere names, but they actually represent something in itself. They're not interchangeable. You can't just translate from one name to another across a language. You can't say, oh, well, the translation for Zeus is Jupiter. You can't do that. Zeus and Jupiter are really separate people who exist in a sort of schizophrenic magical state. So already we can see how the mythic consciousness structure, if you don't understand Gene Gebser, then we can argue in circles forever. But you understand his tripartite, and of course he says there's something after the mental consciousness structure, of course. But I kind of ignore that for this purpose. There are these three stages. There's the original, the magical, the primordial, the Paleolithic, the hunter-gatherer, conception of spirituality and animism, and everything is a god, and that rock is a god, and the stream is a god. And it's not that, oh, well, the stream is divine in the sense that it's related to the water god. No, the stream in itself is a god which is separate from other gods, may be related to other gods by kinship, but it's not that the stream is a subcategory of some general water god. It's no, that the stream in itself, in a Heideggerian sense, in its particular place and time in the world, is a god. Not by analogy, not by mythology. This is a pre-mythological. We're not talking about mythology, we're talking about pre-mythology. So this is kind of the origin of the human psychology that in some sense we're all trying to get back to. In a Paglian sense, we're trying to get back to the womb. We're trying to get back to the thing which is familiar to us in an evolutionary sense. We want to get back to that. But history keeps dragging us quantitatively through the mythic consciousness structure up into the mental consciousness structure, where we're totally alienated from ourselves. What I learned from Locke, and I'd love to put together a compilation of some of the best moments for the streams, because I got like 20 to 40 hours of material to play with, but of course it would take a very long time, so I haven't committed to that. But what I've learned from Locke is that Locke says we do not experience the world as it is, but what we experience are ideas in our heads, which are representations that we receive from sense, from sensory information, from sensation. So there's a radical separation, a radical alienation between the world and our ideas. That the things may correlate, but they ultimately are not the same. The world is not the same as the idea we have of the world. So Locke creates this radical separation, which again, we could relate back, oh, it was the nominalists or the Pythagoreans or whatever. We could turn back the clock and say, oh, well, here's where Locke got his ideas. Specifically in Locke, we see this radical alienation combined with scientific method and empiricism and truth. So what you see is the diametrical opposition of that which is familiar, that which is magical, that which is sacred, from that which is quantitative, empirical, scientific, and so on, and is constantly breaking down the sacred. Now, why does this happen? Why does this happen? There's possibly two explanations. I'll give first the materialistic explanation, which is that the more we attack the sacred, the more space we open up to evolve and to change and to encounter new ideas. And in a military sense, it allows us to develop new technologies. By breaking down sacred structures, we create a sort of ideological or metaphysical Darwinism, wherein those ideas which are false but sacred can be done away with and thrown in the trash. Those which are superior, better, and new can be introduced, and so we can evolve mimetically. Not just genetically, we can evolve mimetically. So this is a reason why we continue to push in this direction, because in some sense, there's a spirit which is reinforced positively by this mimetic generation, which creates military superiority. You know, when you look at guns versus spears, when you look at tanks versus guns, when you look at atom bombs versus tanks, and so on and so forth. And now we're going beyond that. Cyber hacking and EMPs and engineered viruses and all sorts of sci-fi. We can see the ways in which the things which are familiar to us are those which inhibit us from success in war, and the things which break down sacrality are those things which allow for military advancement at the end of the day. So that's one sort of materialistic explanation. The end of that is going to be the supplanting of humanity by a superior military technology, which is in some senses, perhaps conscious. We don't know exactly what that would look like. Maybe it would be a robot. Maybe it would be genetic changes. We don't quite know. But that would be the end result, which would then begin its own process of unfolding and create a new phase of history, a post-human history. Another way of looking at this, because Pete, Peace Boss Boom, who has been a big fan of the channel, big promoter of the channel on Twitter, slicing up different clips and putting them out there. He says, well, okay, this may be what is happening teleologically, but is this good? Is this good? Should we resist this process, is what Pete is asking. And what would it look like to resist this process? What would it mean to resist this process? What would that be about? So I would say there is a kind of Garden of Eden situation we can look at, following from Locke, because Locke talks about, in his letter against the Bishop of Worcester, in his footnote, he says, bodies are distinct when they are made up of different particles. And he gives the example of a seed and a field of grain. He says one seed of grain can be planted, and from that seed of grain, 10 different stalks form. And on those 10 stalks, you have 100 different seeds, and they fall into the ground. They're dispersed by the wind. And then you have 100 new seeds in the ground, and each of those 100 seeds grow up 10 stalks, all with their own seeds, and so on and so forth, until from one little seed of grain, you get an entire field of millions of stalks of grain. So Locke says that the seed, the body of the seed, is not the same as the body of the field of the grain. That those are distinct bodies. That from one seed, one body, we've gotten many bodies, which have drawn, carbon dioxide atoms or molecules from the atmosphere and constituted themselves, and so on and so forth. Which is interesting in itself to think about. Maybe Goethe wrote about plant biology, and from this we got sort of Spengler's organicist theory of civilization. It's an interesting thing to go into in its own right. But what if we suppose for the moment the opposite? What if we suppose that really the field of grain is the seed? What would that mean for humanity? What would that mean genealogically? It would mean that we are Adam. Adam being the first man in the Garden of Eden, we are Adam. And so when Adam had his sons and his daughters and his children, and they reproduced and they populated the earth and they formed the different peoples of the earth, all of those people, all those millions, now billions of people, we are all Adam. We're all Adam, Adam and Eve. We are reincarnations of Adam in different bodies, in the same way that a field of grain, again, this is contrary to Locke. Locke dismisses this out of hand. He says it's impossible, it's illogical, it doesn't make sense. But if we're going to look at what the spiritual perspective or the qualitative perspective would be, in this case, he would say, no, we are all the same body. All of humanity, we're all descended from Adam. And if we look at the universe, or we look at our universe, our world in the current year, and we say, from the time when we first developed agriculture, things have been getting worse. Our teeth have been rotting out. We've developed this priest, warrior, merchant trichotomy. We've invented slavery. We've destroyed the communist egalitarianism of early tribal societies. We've destroyed the sacred. We've destroyed traditions. We've destroyed the diversity of our languages. We've destroyed Dunbar's number. We've destroyed the intimacy, familiarity, friendship, brotherhood, kinship that comes from being in a small Paleolithic tribal unit. We've destroyed our physical health. When you look at Paleolithic hunter-gatherers, they have great physical condition. We've destroyed all that. We've destroyed that, and successively we compound this destruction and degenerate ourselves further. And so every single year that we advance urbanism, we advance science, we advance learning, we advance education, we advance mentalism as a quantitative aspect against our original state, we continue to degenerate to the point today where we've removed all of those connections with nature which serve to keep us healthy. That is, the strong reproduce more children and the weak reproduce less children. We've totally inverted that. So now those who are good have no children, and they even abort their own children willingly. And those who are weak have many children, right? So we've come to this point where now everyone has diseases because we have gone against nature, we've gone against quality, we've gone against God, and everyone has like myopia and cerebral palsy and all of these terrible diseases we've inflicted upon ourselves, and people are living in extreme pain, and we have $1 million endowments to, medical research facilities that are trying to figure out how can we keep this person who is born with only half a heart alive. And yeah, they'll be in extreme pain for the rest of their life, but we have to figure out how to keep these people alive. We have someone who's 90 years old. They're not even conscious. They're in a vegetable state. How can we keep them alive? How can we push people into nursing homes and so on and so forth? How can we prevent heart attacks, which, one day you're happy and then you have a heart attack and then you're dead. That is a terrible thing. So I could go on and on with more examples of how society is constructed to create more alienation for the past 10,000 years. I'm talking about 10,000. I'm not talking about, oh, this is capitalism's fault. No, I'm talking about a huge epoch of human history where things have been degenerating, and that this only seems to compound itself and get worse, and every waking moment seems to be worse and worse. Now, if someone comes up to you on the street and says this, if someone came up to me on the street and said this, I'd say, dude, you sound depressed. Look at all the good things you have. You have a job, you have a wife, you have kids, you have a family, you have a community, you have a church, whatever. I could sit down with them and we could talk about all the things that they have relative to other people. But if we compare all of humanity as a whole, or at least in the first world, Western world, to where we were in the past, from a spiritual point of view, not a scientific point of view, not a technological point of view, but from a qualitative point of view, we could say in a lot of ways the quality of life has decreased. So maybe I've given enough examples. Maybe I haven't. Maybe some people still think we're living in the best year ever. I just watched a video by some German guy. Let's blow up this guy's spot. Let's mention this guy because he kind of wanted to make, maybe this is a video response to him. This dude, is it Eric Dalton? No. It's it's Hans Wilhelm. Hans Wilhelm, the best of times is now, explained by Hans Wilhelm. Which is really, in a way, pathetic, anti-spiritual, quantitative, scientific, Lockean. He's kind of a pathetic excuse for a spiritual man. But he's an interesting foil for what I'm saying here, so people could go watch that video for the alternative take that, we have less poverty than ever before, and people are happier than ever before. But there are many standards by which we could say we are more diseased and sick than ever before. This is in some way something that Nietzsche recognized. So we're looking at all these degenerative aspects, and we ask ourselves, why? Why is this happening? Why is this happening? We could say it's a good thing because it gives us a better military at the end of the day. We say, why is this happening? What happened? Not from a materialistic perspective, which I've already given in this video. Why is this happening from a spiritual perspective? And one way to say is we are Adam. We are all reincarnations of Adam. We are nothing different from Adam. We, the human species, are of one body, and that body is Adam's body. Now, Eve complicates things, but let's just reduce it to Adam for the moment. Adam did something wrong. Adam sinned against God. In a way, Adam was Lucifer. Adam was Satan. It wasn't the snake who tempted Adam, but we're monistically reducing everything, all that guilt, shame, blame, to Adam himself. He rebelled against God. He was Satan. He was God's right-hand man. He was God's finest creation, and he rebelled against God. I'm sort of simplifying the myth for you. And so because of that, God has condemned us to ever successively worse generations, that in every generation we become worse and worse and more diseased and more sick and more against ourselves and more miserable and more neurotic and more frenetic and more anxious and more alienated and more friendless and more divorced and without family and without the concept of the sacred. And every day, it's a meme now, every day we grow further and further from God. That's a meme, but it's kind of the truth in the way that I'm using the term God here. It's kind of the truth. So when you look at this, we're being successively reincarnated in worse and worse states over history. We can look at our ancestors and be jealous of them and realize how far we've fallen, what a miserable state we're in, where we have no friends, no concept of the sacred, everything is questionable, everything is ironical, everything is sarcastic. We're in this current state, and what can we do? From a spiritual perspective. Now, from a material perspective, you do some kind of accelerationist, post-Nietzschean thing where you encourage a revolutionary phenotype where you try to ascend beyond humanity with a new techno-genetically modified super Ubermensch or something. And that's usually what I say. But if you were to take a purely spiritual perspective, a purely qualitative perspective, and to say that this is bad, this is the result of Adam's sin, we're being reincarnated for God to punish Adam's sin here. What is the thing to do? You kind of have to throw up your hands and say, I'm sorry. And don't say I'm sorry, I'm sorry that Adam did that to you, God. I'm sorry Adam rebelled against you. You say, God, I'm sad that I rebelled against you. I'm sad that I, out of pursuit of my own power, I rebelled against you. And I totally submit myself to you. Now, what's the follow-up from that is that you go in the lit woods and live like Ted Kaczynski. You go live as an ascetic. You abandon the internet. You abandon YouTube. You abandon streaming. You abandon civilization. You go live in the woods like Ted Kaczynski. And you become an ascetic. And you dedicate yourself to God. And maybe you do it with a couple of friends. Maybe you're like the Amish. We'll talk about the Amish in the coming days. The Amish are under attack. I've predicted this for a long time. People doubted me. People said it couldn't happen. And they were wrong and I was right. So, but anyways, that's besides the point. That's sort of what you would do. Not a lot of people are going to do that. I'm not going to do that. But that's what you would do if you wanted the spiritual answer, if you wanted to really know. That's what you would have to do. My theory is that you would be dragged back and you'd be reintegrated into society in the same way Ted Kaczynski was dragged back and reintegrated. And we're now reading a PDF of his book. And by reading a PDF of his book, we feel that we're doing something when we're not doing anything at all. We're spinning our wheels while the machine runs over our faces. So resistance is futile, is my message. But if you really wanted to be spiritual, if you really didn't believe in the material world, if you really thought this whole thing was an illusion, Maya, reincarnation, punishment for past sins, that's the sort of thing you would do. You wouldn't be on Twitter. Now, again, I like Pete. So it's not a criticism specific to Pete. It's everybody. If you're truly spiritual, you're not going to be on the internet. You're not going to find a single spiritual person on the internet in the truest absolute sense. Now, again, different people have different levels or definitions or degrees of spirituality, whatever. But you're not going to find an absolutely spiritual person on the internet. Because as McLuhan said, the medium is the message. If you're on the internet, you are participating. Whether you claim to be against spirituality or not, you're a controlled opposition. People criticize me when I say this. They say, well, you're coming at it from a quantitative perspective. I think Zazi is the one who said this. And it's like, yeah, I am. Because I can't escape it. And I recognize that I'm operating functionally from a materialist perspective. Whether I approve it or I'm against it or whatever, anyone who comes on and says, I'm against Satan, and I'm on the internet saying it, that can't be true. That's got to be contradictory from the absolute principles of quality. That has to be false. It can't be true. So if we're on the internet, we're engaging in degrees of quantitative thinking. We're engaging in degrees of mentalism. We're engaging in degrees of what Heidegger called technics. There's no way in which the system defeats itself, except, in my opinion, by creating what Nietzsche called the Übermensch, by creating a new type, a new kind, not just quantitatively different from humanity, not just from 7 billion people to 10 billion people, but a different kind of humanity, a humanity which was reintegrated with reality in a way that destroys the Lockean problem of the alienation of sensation. That is, a new type of humanity which could sense reality directly without going through simulation. I think that would be the solution. So that's my personal solution. And I think if you're on the internet, you kind of have to accept that. But some people aren't, and they're going to play games, semantic games or whatever. But that's where I'm at. That's what I believe. That's what I've kind of taken away from Locke. I had some other things to say in the stream in 5 hours about Schopenhauer and Nietzsche and how they're derived from Locke. And, Locke is... you can go read them yourself. But that was my takeaway. So I just wanted to throw out a short video because I didn't really want to write these ideas out because I don't think they're necessarily significant in themselves. And I haven't quite put them in the proper... I haven't quite put all the pieces together so nicely and so succinctly and so objectively that I could write it down to be an essay in a book, which I've got several. I've read some essays on the channel now. They're all going to be in a book. So I didn't really think this was appropriate. Yeah, I wanted to speak it before I write it. That's kind of my process at this. So that's my mental process. I think before I write, and therefore I'm thinking as I'm speaking, and I'm doing that prior to writing. So you don't have to watch all 20 to 40 hours or whatever of the Locke stream. You can read them yourself or don't. But that was my takeaway. If people want to know, was there anything good that came out of it? Was there anything interesting that came out of it? I had some of these ideas before, but this is where we took it. This is if I had to give a takeaway, if I had to give a summary, this would be it. Thanks for listening. See you next time. Bye bye.